A single fire once erased centuries of human understanding. This video explores the 20 destroyed libraries of antiquity and the lost sciences they took with them. You will gain a complete picture of how these intellectual catastrophes altered the very trajectory of human progress. We will uncover what truly vanished in the flames of Alexandria and why the ink of Baghdad's river ran black. This is not just a history of loss, but a revelation of the forgotten breakthroughs that could have reshaped our world. What do you believe is the greatest price paid when a library falls? To grasp the scale of these losses, we must first step into the mind of the ancient world. Knowledge then was not divided into neat, separate subjects. A single scholar might study the movement of planets, the properties of herbs, the nature of the human soul, and the meaning of dreams, believing them all to be interconnected threads of a universal truth. This was a science woven with philosophy, and astronomy was inseparable from mythology. Their laboratories were not just workshops, but temples and libraries, places where observation met contemplation. The materials they trusted with this wisdom were heartbreakingly fragile. A scroll of papyrus, a sheet of parchment, a tablet of damp clay baked in the sun, each was vulnerable to flame, flood, or simply the slow, consuming hunger of time. This fragility is the first key to understanding the tragedy. When we speak of a lost library, we are not speaking of losing a single book on a single topic. We are speaking of losing an entire constellation of thought, a unique way of seeing the universe. Consider the Great Library of Alexandria at its height. It was far more than a building full of scrolls. It functioned as the central processing unit of the ancient Mediterranean world. Imagine a scholar from Greece arriving with new theorems on geometry. He would find under that same roof Egyptian medical texts detailing surgeries performed centuries before, and Babylonian star charts mapping the heavens with astonishing precision. These ideas would cross-pollinate. A doctor might use geometric principles to better set a bone. An astronomer might use Egyptian records to predict an eclipse. This was a dynamic, living network of human understanding. Because all knowledge was seen as one great tapestry, the destruction of a major library did not merely burn a chapter of history. It could unravel entire disciplines from the fabric of memory. A unique treatise on metallurgy, explaining an alloy formula known only to one culture, could vanish forever. Early theories about the fundamental building blocks of matter, ideas we might recognize as a precursor to atomic theory, could be silenced for over 1,000 years. The loss was not of isolated facts, but of entire pathways of inquiry. When such a hub of knowledge fell, the bridges between different fields of science collapsed, and humanity was often forced to walk the long, hard road of rediscovery spanning generations. This is the true cost we are about to measure. Buried beneath the dust of a fallen empire lies our first great loss. The year is 612 before the Common Era. The mighty city of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, is under siege by a coalition of its enemies. When the walls finally fall, the city is put to the torch and systematically dismantled. In the chaos and collapse, one of humanity's first great experiments in organized knowledge was not burned, but entombed. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal was swallowed by the rubble, hidden for millennia. This library was the life's work of a unique king. Ashurbanipal was a fierce warrior, but he was also a passionate scholar, a ruler who famously learned to read the complex cuneiform script. He dispatched scribes to every corner of his empire with a singular mission: to collect and copy every text they could find. The result was not a haphazard pile of tablets, but a true archive, meticulously organized by subject. Within its chambers were thousands of clay tablets, each one a tiny, durable time capsule. They held the entire intellectual inheritance of Mesopotamia. There were precise astronomical records tracking the movements of Venus, mathematical tablets solving quadratic equations, and detailed legal codes that shaped society. And of course, there were the stories, including the earliest known copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale of friendship, loss, and the search for immortality. The loss when Nineveh fell was catastrophic because this was the bedrock. The sciences and philosophies of ancient Greece, which we often celebrate as the birthplace of Western thought, did not emerge from a vacuum. They were built in part upon this much older Mesopotamian foundation. When the library was buried, that foundation was forgotten. Advanced astronomical data used to predict eclipses vanished from use. Mathematical concepts that would not be independently rediscovered for centuries were silenced. The library's rediscovery by archaeologists in the 19th century was a revelation. Workers digging in the mounds that hid ancient Nineveh began to uncover room after room filled with these broken clay tablets. The sheer volume was staggering. Here was proof of a sophisticated scientific tradition that predated the Greeks by hundreds of years. It was like finding the first several chapters of a book we had been reading starting from the middle. We realized how much of the prologue had been missing. The tragedy of Ashurbanipal's library is a quiet one, a knowledge not set aflame but simply rendered invisible. Its burial created a profound gap in our historical memory, making the brilliant flashes of Greek science seem more like sudden miracles than the next steps in a very long and very ancient conversation. But if Nineveh represents a forgotten foundation, the next loss became the defining symbol of intellectual catastrophe. The Library of Alexandria was more than a collection, it was an idea made manifest. Founded in the 3rd century before the Common Era, it was the ancient world's most ambitious attempt to gather all human knowledge under one roof. The rulers of Ptolemaic Egypt had a simple, staggering policy. Every ship that docked in Alexandria's legendary harbor was searched for scrolls. The texts were confiscated, copied by an army of scribes, and the copies were sometimes given back to the owners, while the originals stayed in the library's vast holdings. This was not a passive repository, it was an aggressive, global knowledge project. Imagine a place where the geometry of Greece met the astronomy of Babylon and the medicine of Egypt. Scholars were paid to live and work there, to think, debate, and push the boundaries of understanding. It was in this environment that Eratosthenes, using little more than a stick and his intellect, calculated the circumference of our planet with astonishing accuracy. It was here that Archimedes, visiting from Syracuse, likely developed his profound principles of mechanics and hydraulics. Their original treatises, written on precious papyrus, resided on those shelves. But so did countless other voices, unique copies of plays by the great Greek dramatians, historical records of vanished civilizations, and medical texts detailing surgical procedures and anatomical knowledge that would not be seen again for over a millennium. The destruction of this library was not a single, cinematic event, but rather a slow-motion unraveling. Historians note it likely suffered from multiple fires over centuries, from accidental blazes during conflicts to targeted actions in periods of political and religious upheaval. Each event consumed another irreplaceable segment of the collection. The final result, however gradual, was the same: incineration. The loss is almost impossible to quantify because we do not know the full extent of what was there. We can only list the possibilities that haunt historians. Advanced mechanical designs, perhaps even early concepts for steam engines, were reduced to ash. A comprehensive history of the Mediterranean, compiled from sources we no longer have, disappeared. Medical knowledge that could have transformed surgery and saved countless lives was lost for 1,000 years. This was not merely the burning of books, it was the burning of potential futures. The setback to human innovation was staggering, forcing countless minds across subsequent generations to rediscover, often painfully and slowly, what had already been known, pondered, and written down in that one great hall by the sea. The ghost of Alexandria is the ghost of a shortcut we never got to take. Alexandria's greatest rival was not another city, but another library. High on a hilltop in what is now Turkey, the kings of Pergamum built a sanctuary of learning meant to challenge Egypt's dominance. Their ambition was so potent it sparked an ancient trade war. Legend says the Ptolemies in Alexandria, threatened by Pergamum's rapid growth, cut off their supply of papyrus, the essential paper of the ancient world. The scholars of Pergamum responded not with surrender but with innovation. They refined the process of preparing animal skins, creating a smoother, more durable writing surface we know as parchment. This was the birth of a technology that would carry knowledge through the Middle Ages. The library itself became a beacon, housing an estimated 200,000 volumes. Its strengths were distinct. While Alexandria sought universal breadth, Pergamum cultivated depth in specific fields. It was renowned for a school of medicine that rivaled any in the world, with texts detailing advanced surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and anatomical observations lost to us today. It was also a center for the arts, holding treatises on sculptural techniques that explain the breathtaking realism of Pergamene altars. Perhaps most critically, it amassed an unparalleled collection of philosophical commentaries. These were not just copies of Plato or Aristotle, but layers of debate, interpretation, and critique written by generations of scholars. They represented the living, breathing conversation of Greek scientific thought. The fate of this great collection is a story of dispersal. Long before any final fire, its holdings were scattered. When the Roman general Mark Antony reportedly gifted the entire library to Cleopatra as a wedding present, the scrolls were sent to Alexandria. This act, meant as a romantic gesture, may have ironically concentrated the ancient world's knowledge into one vulnerable target, setting up both libraries for a shared catastrophe. Other volumes were looted by Roman collectors or simply decayed as the city's importance faded. The loss, therefore, was not a single, clean erasure, but a slow leaking away of specialized understanding. We lost the precise methods of Pergamene doctors, the technical secrets of its artists, and most hauntingly, the nuanced philosophical arguments that provided the essential context for early scientific ideas. Without those commentaries, our understanding of ancient thought is like hearing one side of a complex telephone conversation. We have the conclusions, but we've lost the reasoning, the objections, and the intellectual journey that led there. The shadow of Pergamum reminds us that knowledge is not just data, it is a dialogue, and when the voices of that dialogue are silenced, the science they shaped becomes far harder to truly comprehend. Constantinople stood as a lone fortress of light. While the libraries of the West crumbled into silence, the Imperial Library in the heart of the Byzantine Empire became the final guardian of a vanishing world. For over 1,000 years, it preserved the fragile papyrus and parchment threads connecting the medieval present to the classical past. But its story is not one of a dramatic, fiery end like Alexandria. This was a slower, more insidious tragedy, a death by 1,000 cuts. The library endured not a single cataclysm, but a relentless series of blows. Political riots within the city's turbulent streets often spilled into destruction. The infamous Fourth Crusade in 1204, a shocking betrayal by fellow Christians, saw the city sacked and countless treasures looted or burned. With each crisis, another portion of the collection disappeared. Yet the library persisted, a wounded but breathing archive, right up to the final, defining moment in 1453. When the city's walls finally fell to the Ottoman forces, the last chapter of this great repository was closed. The surviving texts were scattered, repurposed, or lost. This slow erosion had a uniquely devastating consequence. Constantinople was not just another library, it was the last one. It held the final known copies of works by ancient scientists, philosophers, and engineers. When a text here decayed beyond repair or was destroyed, it vanished from human memory forever. Think of the practical knowledge that simply evaporated. The precise formula for Roman concrete, a material so durable it has lasted millennia, may have been detailed in a scroll that turned to dust in a damp Constantinople basement. Advanced treatises on Byzantine engineering, covering everything from monumental dome construction to the secrets of their legendary siege weapons like Greek fire, faded away. This was not just the loss of abstract philosophy, it was the loss of applied science, the instruction manuals for an ancient technological world. The disappearance of this practical wisdom created a tangible delay in human progress. Western Europe, emerging from its own period of hardship, would spend generations rediscovering principles of architecture, mechanics, and chemistry that had been meticulously catalogued and then lost in the slow decay of Constantinople's shelves. The library's fate teaches us a somber lesson. Sometimes the greatest threat to knowledge is not a sudden explosion, but the quiet, relentless drip of time, conflict, and neglect, a process that can erase even the most foundational truths if no one is left to tend the flame. But if Constantinople represents a slow fading, the fate of Baghdad was a single, shattering blow. The year was 1258, and the Mongol Empire under Hulagu Khan laid siege to the city. The aftermath was not merely a military conquest, it was an intellectual annihilation. The House of Wisdom, the brilliant epicenter of the Islamic Golden Age, was systematically destroyed. Its contents were not just burned, they were thrown into the Tigris River. Contemporary accounts describe a river of knowledge, the ink from countless manuscripts leaching out until the waters ran dark. This image, the blackened Tigris, stands as one of history's most powerful symbols of cultural loss. But to understand the true scale of the tragedy, we must see the House of Wisdom for what it truly was. This was far more than a quiet hall for storing books. It was a vibrant, state-funded institute of translation and research, a bustling crossroads of global thought. Here, scholars gathered not only to preserve, but to synthesize and advance. They took the philosophical works of the Greeks, the mathematical genius of India, and the astronomical records of Persia, and wove them together into something entirely new. The loss, therefore, was catastrophic and multi-layered. First, we lost the original, groundbreaking works produced within its walls. The foundational texts of algebra by Al-Qarawiyyin, whose very name gives us the word algorithm, were likely consumed by the waters. The revolutionary studies of optics by Al-Haytham, who pioneered the scientific method centuries before the Renaissance, vanished. Vast astronomical tables, the product of lifetimes of observation at the Baghdad Observatory, were scattered and destroyed. But the second loss is perhaps even more profound. The House of Wisdom held unique Arabic translations of ancient Greek texts. In many cases, these translations were the only surviving copies in the entire world, the original Greek versions having been lost centuries earlier in the decay of places like Constantinople. These books were not just copies, they were the last bridges back to the mind of Aristotle, to the geometry of Euclid, to the medicine of Galen. When the Mongols threw those volumes into the Tigris, they weren't just destroying Arab scholarship, they were severing the final, fragile link in a chain of transmission that stretched back to antiquity itself. An entire conduit of human thought was washed away in that dark water, setting back the shared scientific inheritance of our world by incalculable measure. The blackened river was a wound in time itself. While the Tigris ran black with ink, another fire burned on the other side of the world, a blaze so immense it was said to have lasted for months. This was the final chapter of Nalanda University, a center of learning so vast and influential it makes our modern idea of a university seem modest. Founded in the 5th century in what is now Bihar, India, Nalanda was not a single building but a sprawling campus, a true city of knowledge. It hosted thousands of students and scholars from across Asia, drawn to its halls to study everything from logic and linguistics to medicine and metaphysics. At its heart stood a library complex so grand it was housed in multi-storied buildings with names like Ratnadadhi, the Ocean of Jewels, and it was this ocean that was set alight in the late 12th century. The destruction of Nalanda is often attributed to invading forces, a military campaign that viewed this immense repository of Buddhist thought as a threat to be eradicated. But to call it merely a library fire is to misunderstand completely. This was the annihilation of an entire ecosystem of learning. The flames consumed a comprehensive archive that represented centuries of uninterrupted scholarly debate. Lost were profound philosophical works of Mahayana Buddhism, intricate texts on Sanskrit grammar that were keys to a vast literary tradition, and medical manuals detailing Ayurvedic practices that included sophisticated surgical procedures. The scientific losses were staggering. Advanced Indian astronomical models, which tracked planetary movements with remarkable accuracy, turned to ash. Detailed treatises on metallurgy, explaining techniques for producing the famed high-quality Indian steel, were lost. Perhaps most haunting is what the fire may have taken from the very foundations of mathematics. Scholars at Nalanda were deeply engaged with concepts like zero, infinity, and the decimal system. Their theoretical explorations of these ideas were likely more developed than anything being discussed in medieval Europe at the same time. The burning of Ratnadadhi did not just destroy books, it severed a leading edge of mathematical thought, a devastating blow that scattered a scientific tradition and left the rest of the world to rediscover these paths centuries later. The fire that burned for months did more than consume parchment and palm leaves. It created a silence where once there was a vibrant, global conversation. That profound silence in the East finds a terrible echo across the Atlantic, in the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula. Here, the destruction was not born from the chaos of invasion, but from a chillingly systematic conviction. In the 1560s, the Franciscan friar Diego de Landa orchestrated a great burning. He gathered countless Maya books, their pages made of fig bark paper, and he set them ablaze in a single, catastrophic auto-da-fe. His mission was to erase what he saw as idolatry and superstition. But what he actually set on fire was the scientific and historical voice of an entire civilization. From this colossal act of cultural erasure, only 4 of these codices are known to have survived. Think about that scale for a moment. We are not discussing the loss of a single library's collection, but the near-total annihilation of a written tradition. The Maya had developed the most sophisticated writing system in the Americas, and with a stroke of a torch, centuries of accumulated insight were reduced to smoke and ash. What exactly went up in those flames? We lost first and foremost their mastery of time. The Maya astronomical calendars were not simple almanacs. They were intricate, interlocking cycles that could predict celestial events like solar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, mapping the cosmos across spans of thousands of years. We lost the full depth of their mathematical genius, a system that used a base 20-numeral system, and critically, the concept of zero, an idea they developed independently from the rest of the world. Their codices contained detailed records of the natural world, precise taxonomies of local plants and animals, and medical knowledge that utilized hundreds of herbs for remedies we can only now guess at. The engineering principles behind their towering pyramids and complex water management systems, once explained in those texts, are now silent. Today, archaeologists and epigraphers perform a kind of intellectual archaeology, painstakingly piecing together hints of this lost science from the carved stone monuments that the friars could not burn. They are trying to reconstruct a symphony from a few scattered notes, The burning of the Maya codices stands as one of history's most definitive lessons in how ideological certainty can willingly obliterate a unique pathway of human understanding, leaving us forever wondering what precise truths about the universe, written in bark paper books, we will never get to read. While the Maya codices burned in a distant land back in the Mediterranean, the great intellectual beacon of Alexandria was experiencing its own final, definitive darkening. The main library was likely gone, but its spirit had endured in a grand annex, the Serapeum. This was more than a storage room for overflow scrolls. It was a magnificent temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis, designed as a public sanctuary of knowledge. In the year 391, under the edicts of the Christian Emperor Theodosius I, this last pillar of Alexandria's scholarly world was ordered destroyed. A mob, encouraged by the local patriarch, stormed the complex. The great statue of Serapis was pulled down, and the temple itself was either demolished or converted into a church. But the true loss was what happened to the collections inside. The Serapeum was the last refuge for texts deemed dangerous or heretical by the rising Orthodox authority. Within its walls sat specialized collections of Neoplatonic philosophy, which explored the nature of reality and the cosmos through reason and mystical insight. There were Hermetic texts, a blend of spirituality, astrology, and early proto-scientific thought, alternative histories that might have challenged official narratives, and scientific works rooted in pagan natural philosophy. All were likely consumed in the flames or simply scattered and lost. This event was not an accident of war, it was a deliberate ideological closure. The destruction of the Serapeum symbolized a seismic shift, the moment when a certain kind of open, rational inquiry, tied to the old gods and the classical world, was officially supplanted by a new order. It marked the end of Alexandria as the unchallenged capital of the human mind. A major door to ancient ways of understanding the natural world was slammed shut, and the key was thrown away. The great conversation that had echoed in its halls for centuries was replaced by a demanding silence. That final door slamming in Alexandria echoed a pattern set centuries earlier, one of total conquest and intellectual erasure. When Rome finally defeated its great rival Carthage in the year 146 before the Common Era, the Senate demanded more than surrender. They demanded obliteration. The city was razed, the earth salted, and its people scattered. But the Romans, pragmatic even in their ruthlessness, may have done something revealing with the city's libraries. Ancient sources suggest the collections were not burned, but given as a gift to allied Numidian kings in North Africa. This might sound like preservation, but it was a form of scattering, a deliberate dismantling of a knowledge system. Carthage was not just another city, it was the pinnacle of Phoenician civilization, a maritime empire built on centuries of seafaring, trade, and adaptation. Its libraries were the logged memory of that expertise. Within them were detailed periply, sailing logs that charted routes down the African coast and possibly far into the Atlantic, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. What shores did those logs describe? We will likely never know. There were advanced maps, treatises on shipbuilding, and complex understandings of seasonal winds and currents that turned the Mediterranean into a Phoenician highway. Perhaps even more devastating for the long term was the loss of Carthaginian agricultural science. They had mastered dry land farming in North Africa, developing sustainable irrigation and soil techniques to feed their populous city. These practical, ecological texts could have transformed Roman agriculture in their new African provinces. Instead, that locally adapted wisdom was dispersed and forgotten, a loss of resilience written in the silent language of scattered scrolls. This was not an act of mindless violence, but a calculated one. Rome understood that to truly eliminate a rival, you must also erase its mind, its accumulated genius. By gifting the libraries away, they severed the living connection between the knowledge and the civilization that created it. The science of Carthage, a unique fusion of Phoenician, African, and Hellenistic thought was dissolved into the sands, leaving only the ghost of its reputation and a warning from Cotto's relentless refrain, Carthago delenda esti. Carthage must be destroyed, and with it, an entire world of exploration and environmental wisdom simply vanished. That same brutal logic of conquest, the erasure of a rival's mind, reached a horrific crescendo half a world away centuries later. In 1521, as the great city of Tenochtitlan fell, a different kind of library burned. The Spanish conquistadors and accompanying friars targeted the Amexcali, the book houses. To them, these vast archives of folded bark paper and deerskin, filled with intricate, colorful pictographs, were not repositories of science. They were instruments of idolatry, a threat to the spiritual conquest they believed was their divine duty. So they gathered them in public squares and in temple courtyards and set them alight. The scale of the loss is almost incomprehensible. Out of what historians estimate were thousands of these codices, only a handful survive today. Think of each one not as a simple book, but as a dense, interactive database. Their pictographic language recorded everything from dynastic histories to the precise movements of Venus, which they tracked with astonishing accuracy. The lost sciences here were profoundly practical, born from centuries of observation in a unique environment. Detailed botanical taxonomies classified hundreds of medicinal plants, with knowledge of their uses that modern pharmacology is still trying to reconstruct. Their medical texts documented treatments for ailments, surgical practices, and a holistic understanding of the body that intertwined with their spiritual beliefs. Perhaps most visibly lost were the engineering principles behind the city itself. Tenochtitlan was a marvel of hydraulic engineering, a vast city built on a lake with complex causeways, dikes to control salinity, and intricate aqueducts bringing fresh water from the mainland. The codices held the maintenance manuals, the hydrological surveys, the applied mathematics that made it all work. With their destruction, we are left trying to reverse engineer genius from ruins and from accounts written by the very conquerors who sought to replace that worldview. This was more than burning paper. It was the deliberate silencing of a continent's scientific voice, forcing history to be told through the interpreter, forever leaving us to wonder what magnificent chapters were lost in the smoke. The fate of knowledge is not always decided by a single, violent flame. Sometimes it succumbs to a slow, relentless chill, the quiet tragedy of being forgotten. In the ancient city of Fez, Morocco, stands the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, founded in the year 859 and recognized as one of the oldest continuously operating universities on Earth. Its library still exists, a beautiful and revered space, but that continuity masks a profound and subtle loss. For centuries, its collections endured a different kind of assault, not from a conquering army, but from the creeping forces of decay, theft, and simple neglect. Unlike the libraries consumed in a dramatic blaze, this was a story of attrition, where irreplaceable manuscripts did not vanish in an instant, but faded from memory one crumbling page at a time. The losses here were often silent and unrecorded. A manuscript on early chemistry containing recipes for dyes or alloys that represented generations of experimentation might be borrowed and never returned, its insights dissolving into private hands. A treatise critiquing the astronomical models of Ptolemy, which could have nudged scientific thought toward a more accurate understanding of the cosmos, might simply rot in a damp corner because no scholar was funded to copy it. These texts held advanced geometric principles that shaped the very architecture of the region, designs that encoded mathematical harmony. They contained pharmacological knowledge, detailed lists of herbs and compounds with medicinal properties that were the result of careful observation. Each volume that was lost or damaged represented a unique thread in the tapestry of Islamic Golden Age scholarship. This slow-motion dispersal teaches us a crucial and perhaps more insidious lesson. Knowledge is not just destroyed, it can simply be abandoned. When a society stops copying its old texts, when it ceases to teach the ideas within them, that knowledge effectively vanishes, even if the physical object lingers for a while in a forgotten chest. The library at Al-Qarawiyyin survived, but countless of its children, the copies and commentaries that should have spread its wisdom across generations, did not. This is the cost of neglect, a gradual amnesia that can be just as final as any fire. While neglect can quietly erase knowledge, the collapse of an entire empire can tear it apart in a storm of chaos. This was the fate of the Imperial Library of the Han Dynasty. For over 4 centuries, the Han had unified China, fostering an unprecedented era of scholarship and bureaucratic organization. Their imperial libraries were the central vault of this achievement, systematically collecting works on every subject deemed vital to governing a civilization. At its heart was a master catalogue known as the 7 Epitomes, the first of its kind in China, which did not just list titles but organized the entire world of knowledge into philosophical categories. This was more than a library, it was the operating manual for a vast and sophisticated state. Then, in the year 220, the dynasty crumbled. The empire fractured into the warring states of the Three Kingdoms period, a time of relentless conflict and upheaval. In the turmoil, palaces were sacked, and those great libraries were not a priority to protect. They became targets or simply casualties of the widespread disorder. Think of it as the catastrophic failure of a central server with no backups. The scrolls containing the 7 epitomes were lost, and with them, the precise map to everything else the library had held. The losses were devastatingly specific. Treatises on seismography, detailing the workings of ingenious earthquake detection instruments invented by Han scientists, were scattered or burned. Advanced manuals on hydraulic engineering, explaining the maintenance of the complex canal systems and flood controls that stabilized Chinese agriculture, disappeared. Countless works on early proto-chemistry, what we would call alchemy, recording centuries of experimentation with minerals and materials in the search for medicines and elixirs, vanished into the smoke of a collapsing order. This was not merely the loss of old ideas, it was the destruction of active, applied science. The regression that followed was profound. Administrative knowledge on how to run a census, manage granaries, and standardize measurements had to be painfully relearned. Technical skills in engineering and instrument making faced a similar setback. Subsequent dynasties would spend centuries trying to reconstruct this foundational knowledge, often having to rediscover from scratch what the Han scholars had already mastered and meticulously written down. The fall of the Han Library shows us that the stability of a society is the true guardian of its science. When the political order shattered, the accumulated wisdom it had curated shattered with it, setting the clock of progress back for generations. The fate of a library often hinges on the intentions of its conquerors. When Arab forces captured the magnificent Sasanian Persian capital of Ctesiphon in the year 637, the Royal Library faced an uncertain future. This was not a simple repository, but the intellectual heart of a rival empire, steeped in the Zoroastrian faith and centuries of Persian scholarship. While it is true that some of its knowledge was later translated and absorbed into the burgeoning Islamic scholarly tradition, this process was selective. Much of the library's unique character was erased. Think of it not as a full translation, but a filtering. Texts on statecraft, Zoroastrian theology, and specific histories that did not align with the new order were likely set aside or destroyed. The loss was profound. We are missing the original Sasanian astronomical charts that tracked celestial movements across the Persian plateau, medical texts that may have blended Greek ideas with local remedies, and the intricate administrative manuals for running one of the ancient world's most sophisticated bureaucracies. This creates a silent gap in the historical record, a missing chapter in the story of the Silk Road. Persia was not merely a passive route for trade, but an active crucible where ideas from India, China, and the Mediterranean were debated, synthesized, and transformed. By losing the primary sources from Ctesiphon, we have obscured Persia's own role as a powerhouse of innovation, a role that directly set the stage for the Islamic Golden Age that would soon follow. We are left to wonder what original breakthroughs in mathematics or engineering were recorded there, ideas that vanished into the sands long before they could influence the wider world. The quiet hum of a monastic scriptorium was a sound of profound resistance. In the centuries following Rome's collapse, as much of Europe grappled with political fragmentation, it was within the stone walls of Irish monasteries like Clonmacnoise and Kells that the written word found a stubborn refuge. Here, monks meticulously copied texts by candlelight, preserving not only scripture but the very tools of civilization itself. Their work was a sacred duty, safeguarding Latin grammars, historical chronicles, and fragments of early scientific thought from a disappearing world. These were not mere book repositories, they were active schools and the last functioning libraries in Western Europe, keeping a fragile flame of literacy alive through what we often call the Dark Ages. Then from the sea came a new and utterly different sound. Beginning in the late 8th century, the longships appeared. Viking raiders seeking wealth and conquest saw these isolated monastic communities not as sanctuaries of learning, but as undefended treasuries filled with gold, silver, and precious artifacts. The raids were swift and brutal. Monasteries were plundered and burned, and their libraries faced catastrophic loss. Imagine a unique copy of a Roman agricultural manual, the only one to have survived the empire's fall, being tossed aside or used to kindle a fire. Consider an Irish scholar's original commentary on astronomy, painstakingly written in the margins of a parchment, now turned to ash. Each raid was a pinprick in a vast reservoir, but with each attack, the level of preserved knowledge dropped a little more. The loss was twofold. First, it erased unique copies of classical texts that had made the perilous journey to Ireland's shores, works that might have been the last of their kind. Second, and just as devastating, it destroyed indigenous scholarship, the original chronicles, poems, and legal texts that recorded early Irish history and innovation. This was not a single, catastrophic fire like Alexandria, but a death by 1,000 cuts across generations. Every stolen gospel book, every burned batch of parchment, dimmed that carefully tended lamp of learning, making Europe's intellectual recovery a slower, more difficult climb out of the shadows. While Viking raids chipped away at Europe's memory, a different kind of loss was unfolding in the East, one born not of fire and axe but of quiet abandonment. In the fertile plains of ancient Persia stood the Academy of Gondeshapur, a beacon of intellectual fusion long before the term became fashionable. Founded in the 3rd century, this was not merely a library but a thriving university and hospital, a crossroads where the world's knowledge converged. Greek medical texts translated into Syriac sat alongside treatises on Indian mathematics and surgery. Zoroastrian scholars debated philosophy with Nestorian Christians, while astronomers compared Greek star charts with observations from the Indus Valley. Gondeshapur was a living laboratory of synthesis, where the best ideas from disparate cultures were tested, blended, and applied. Its greatest contribution was perhaps in medicine, where its hospital pioneered a model of institutional care, integrating Greek diagnostic methods with Indian herbal remedies and surgical techniques. This was practical, cross-cultural science at its most potent, yet its decline was gradual and in many ways a victim of its own legacy success. Following the Arab conquests in the 7th century, the intellectual center of gravity shifted. The newly established House of Wisdom in Baghdad began to draw scholars and resources, becoming the new star in the Islamic Golden Age. Gondeshapur faded, its buildings crumbling, its unique manuscripts succumbing to damp, theft, and simple neglect. The loss here is particularly subtle and profound. We didn't lose just raw data, we lost the process. We lost the annotated text showing how a Greek physician adapted an Indian technique, the debate records where a mathematical concept was refined through conversation, the very model of a collaborative, multicultural research center. The sciences that vanished were those of applied fusion, the very kind of work that, if continuously nurtured, could have shortcut centuries of later rediscovery. Its silence reminds us that progress depends not just on preserving knowledge, but on actively sustaining the unique, fragile environments where that knowledge is creatively remade. A different kind of desert held its own fragile trove of wisdom far to the south. In the sun-baked city of Timbuktu, knowledge was not stored in one grand building, but woven into the very fabric of the community. For centuries, from the 1300s onward, private homes and family collections safeguarded hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. These were not simple scrolls, but detailed works of profound scholarship, written in flowing Arabic and local languages, their pages filled with diagrams of the stars, complex mathematical equations, and intricate legal arguments. This was the beating heart of the Songhai Empire's intellectual life, a testament to a thriving, sophisticated scholarly tradition in the very center of West Africa. The sciences preserved here were born of necessity and deep observation. Astronomers tracked celestial movements to navigate the vast, featureless Sahara, creating star charts that guided caravans carrying salt and gold. Mathematicians developed advanced calculations for trade, inheritance, and architecture. Medical texts documented local plants and treatments, forming a distinct body of African medicinal knowledge. And legal scholars produced dense commentaries on governance and commerce, proving that complex economic theory was being debated under the Sahelian sun, long before it became a standard subject in European universities. The tragedy of Timbuktu was not a single, catastrophic fire, but a slow, relentless scattering. The threats were manifold, a silent storm eroding this paper-based civilization. The arid climate itself, while preserving some texts, slowly desiccated others. Political instability and conflict led to periods of panic, where families would bury their libraries in desert caves or secret rooms, a practice that saved many, but also condemned some to be forgotten or consumed by insects and damp. Outright neglect, as colonial powers dismissed the value of African intellectual heritage, caused collections to disintegrate in obscurity. Each manuscript that crumbled or was lost took with it a unique voice, a specific solution, a different perspective on the cosmos. The loss here is a gap in our global story. Every missing text from Timbuktu is a missing piece of evidence in the history of science, one that challenges the outdated and narrow idea that advanced scholarship was the sole property of other continents. It represents a severed thread in the tapestry of human thought, making it harder for us to see the full, interconnected picture of our collective intellectual journey. The heroic modern efforts to preserve what remains only highlight the magnitude of what has already slipped through the sands of time. But what if a library was more than just a warehouse for completed ideas? The true heart of Alexandria's intellectual revolution was not merely its collection, but its engine room, a place called the Museum. Think of it as the ancient world's most advanced university and research campus combined, a state-funded institute where the greatest minds were given a salary, meals, and a place to live, all for the singular purpose of thinking. This was where the scrolls from the great library came alive. Scholars didn't just read about geometry, they argued over it in shaded colonnades. Physicians didn't just copy medical texts, they likely dissected specimens to understand anatomy. The loss of the museum is a different kind of catastrophe, one harder to quantify but perhaps more profound. When it faded into history, we didn't just lose books, we lost the laboratory. Imagine the countless notes scribbled in the margins of experiments that never made it into a formal treatise. Picture the prototypes of devices that were tinkered with and improved in workshops attached to the complex. We know of devices like Heron's earlipile, a spinning sphere powered by steam, essentially a primitive steam engine. The surviving description is fascinating, but it was treated as a curiosity, a temple wonder. What we lost were the working models, the sketches of modifications, the records of discussions among engineers about how this principle could be applied. Without the collaborative, experimental culture of the museum, such inventions remained isolated novelties, never iterated upon, never connected to a larger system of mechanical knowledge that could have industrialized the ancient world. The true tragedy is the extinction of a methodology. The museum established a process for turning observation into theory and theory into tested application. Its destruction meant that for centuries, the very model of how to do organized, state-supported science was forgotten. Knowledge became something to be preserved and commented upon, rather than something to be challenged and expanded through collective experimentation. So while we mourn the scrolls of Alexandria, we should also mourn its silence, the end of the vibrant, noisy, contentious conversations that once filled its halls, conversations that were the true source of its power. South of Egypt, along the winding Nile, another empire mastered the river's power. The kingdom of Kush, with its capital at Marave, was a formidable force, even conquering its northern neighbor and ruling as pharaohs for a century. We know they were scholars and innovators, creators of a written script we call Meroitic. We have stone inscriptions, but the vast majority of their records, written on perishable materials like papyrus or leather, have vanished completely. This is not a story of a single, flaming library, but of a slow, suffocating silence. As the kingdom's influence waned, its cities were gradually reclaimed by the desert sands, and with them, any centralized repository of its knowledge simply crumbled into dust. The loss here is uniquely profound because it is almost total, leaving us with an enigma. We can see the results of their science in the archaeological record, but we cannot hear their explanations. We stand before the ruins of massive iron smelting furnaces, entire industrial zones that made Kush one of the ancient world's industrial powerhouses. They produced high-quality steel on a scale that rivals any contemporary culture, yet the technical manuals, the recipes for their alloys, the designs of their bellows and forges are gone. We see the remnants of sophisticated water management systems, canals and reservoirs that tamed the Nile's floods for agriculture in a harsh climate. But the hydrological surveys, the engineering principles behind these projects are silent. We find artifacts suggesting a deep understanding of the stars, likely used for both calendrical and spiritual purposes, mapping a sky unseen from Greece or Rome. But their astronomical charts and celestial narratives are lost to us. The Meroitic script itself remains only partially deciphered, a locked door. So we are left with a civilization's magnificent footprints, but without its voice. This represents one of the most complete erasures in our story. An entire intellectual tradition, developed independently in Africa, was dissolved by time and climate before it could be translated or copied by others. It is a stark reminder that knowledge is not just burned, it can simply be forgotten, its containers turning to powder, leaving behind only the ghostly outline of what was once known. While the great library of Constantinople endured its slow decline, a quieter, more diffused tragedy was unfolding across the empire's vast provinces. As Byzantine borders shrank under relentless pressure, the regional libraries in cities like Antioch, Ephesus, and Thessaloniki faced a fate of gradual dissolution. These were not imperial repositories, but vital community caches, the local universities and monastic scriptoria of their day. They held the practical and intellectual wealth of their regions, copies of classical Greek texts on medicine and mathematics, records of local theological councils, and manuals detailing innovations in agriculture, architecture, and law specific to their locale. Their destruction was not a single catastrophic event, but a creeping erosion over centuries. A library in Antioch might be plundered during a siege, its parchments repurposed as fuel or packing material. A collection in a coastal city like Ephesus could be abandoned as populations shifted inland, left to the damp and the insects. Another in the Balkans might be scattered by invading forces who valued the jeweled covers of books, but not the words inside. Each of these losses was a death by 1,000 cuts to the classical tradition. Imagine a vast network where each major city held a copy or a unique commentary on the works of Archimedes or Galen. As one city's library vanished, that particular version of the text, perhaps with invaluable marginal notes from a local scholar, disappeared forever. The loss was compounded because these provincial centers were often the very places where ancient knowledge was adapted and applied, where Roman engineering principles met local materials to create new forms of architecture, or where Greek medical theories were tested against regional herbs and illnesses. When these libraries were lost, we did not just lose another copy of a known book, we lost the living context of that knowledge, the evidence of how it was used and debated in daily life. This piecemeal destruction over hundreds of years ensured that by the time Italian scholars began eagerly searching for classical manuscripts, the vast tapestry of Greco-Roman learning had already been frayed beyond repair. Only a few strong threads, those safeguarded in the most remote monasteries or preserved through sheer luck, remained to be rewoven into the Renaissance. Every provincial archive that turned to dust was a silent subtraction from our collective memory, a forgotten chapter in the manual of antiquity. As the great public and provincial libraries faded, another, more intimate repository of knowledge quietly vanished from the world. The final library on our list was not a single building, but a scattered tradition, the private collection of a Roman aristocrat. In the sprawling villas of senators and wealthy patricians, a personal library was a mark of status and intellectual refinement. These were not merely displays of wealth, but working collections filled with scrolls and, later, codices on philosophy, poetry, history, and, crucially, the technical arts. They held manuals on surveying land for aqueducts, detailed guides for managing vast agricultural estates, architectural plans for heating systems and concrete construction, and personal notes on everything from metallurgy to medicine. This was the applied science of a functioning empire, the practical know-how that maintained a civilization. With the political and economic collapse of the Western Roman Empire, this aristocratic class itself disintegrated. Facing upheaval, many families sold their treasures to survive. Priceless scrolls were scraped clean and rewritten with religious texts, their original contents lost forever. Other collections were simply abandoned in decaying villas, left to be consumed by damp, fire, or insects. This was a decentralized, almost invisible catastrophe. Because these libraries were private, their complete destruction left no central record of what was lost. We are left to wonder about the unique commentaries on engineering texts, the personal logs of ship captains that might have detailed trade routes beyond the empire, or the refined recipes for Roman concrete that died with the family that perfected them. The disappearance of these collections marked more than the loss of objects. It signaled the end of an entire secular tradition of learning. For centuries, scientific inquiry and technical innovation had been supported by a cultured, wealthy elite who valued knowledge for its own sake and for its practical benefits. When that social and economic foundation crumbled, the very ecosystem that nurtured and preserved advanced thought collapsed with it. The Dark Ages that followed were dark not merely because of war, but because the countless lamps kept lit in private studies across the empire had been snuffed out, one by one, leaving the practical sciences of daily life to be rediscovered through painful trial and error centuries later. From the ashes of Nineveh to the drowned scrolls of Baghdad, we have traced a map of intellectual devastation. This journey reveals a story far greater than a simple list of burned buildings. It is a stark, sobering reminder of how fragile human knowledge truly is, and the immense price we pay for cultural intolerance, for conflict, and for simple neglect. Each of these libraries was a universe of thought, a collection of questions and answers painstakingly gathered over generations. When they were lost, we did not just lose old books. We lost entire branches on the tree of human understanding. The advanced mechanics dreamed in Alexandria, the precise astronomical models calculated in Nalanda, the complex herbal medicines recorded in Tenochtitlan, these were not mere historical footnotes. They represent alternate paths our civilization could have walked, potential shortcuts in our collective journey that might have spared us centuries of stagnation and rediscovery. Imagine a world where the synthesis of Greek and Indian medicine from Gondeshapur had flourished uninterrupted, or where the Mayas' profound understanding of time had been shared with the world. Our present would be profoundly different. Now, as we stand in an age where we digitize everything from family photos to the complete works of humanity, this history must serve as our cautionary tale. It urges us to look at our own repositories, our servers and cloud archives and digital libraries, and ask how we will protect them. It challenges us to cherish and actively defend our collective intellectual heritage, because the story of these 20 libraries proves that progress is not inevitable. It is a flame that must be continuously fed and shielded from the wind. So we are left with a haunting question, one that echoes down through all these empty halls and silent scriptoria. What other breakthroughs, what other masterpieces of philosophy or revelations about the natural world lie buried forever in those lost archives? Which of these vanished libraries do you think held the secret that could have changed our world the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to keep exploring the profound mysteries of our past, be sure to subscribe. The story of these libraries is not a series of random accidents. When we step back, a terrifying symmetry emerges from the chaos. Across continents and centuries, the forces that tore knowledge apart fall into just a few devastatingly familiar categories. The first is the fire of conquest, a deliberate act of cultural erasure. When invaders sacked Tenochtitlan or Mongol armies threw the books of Baghdad into the Tigris, the goal was not merely to defeat an enemy, but to dismantle their very identity. Burning a library was a statement. It declared that a people's history, their science, their understanding of the world was illegitimate and must be replaced. The second pattern is the purifying flame of faith, where religious authorities deemed certain knowledge dangerous. The scrolls of the Serapeum in Alexandria or the Maya Codices in the Yucatan were not casualties of war but of conviction. They were burned because the ideas within them challenged a new orthodoxy, because their very existence was seen as an affront to a single, accepted truth. In these moments, curiosity itself became a sin. Then there is the collapse that comes from within, the third pattern. When the Han Dynasty fractured or the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the intricate systems that supported scholarship, the patrons, the scribes, the safe buildings vanished overnight. Imperial libraries were looted not by foreign armies, but by the chaos of civil strife and economic collapse. The knowledge they held became irrelevant in the struggle for basic survival, left to rot in abandoned palaces. Finally, and perhaps most insidiously, there is the slow death by neglect. This is the pattern of Constantinople and the fading libraries of Timbuktu. No dramatic fire, no single conquering army, just the gradual, century-long decay brought on by a lack of resources, by shifting priorities, by the simple, heartbreaking fact that a society stopped valuing what its ancestors had so carefully preserved. The parchments crumbled, the ink faded, and the people who could read them passed away, leaving behind silent, crumbling vaults. These four patterns, conquest, iconoclasm, collapse, and neglect, all point to a single, profound truth. The enemy of knowledge is rarely ignorance. It is far more often certainty. It is the absolute certainty of a conqueror that another culture has nothing worth saving. It is the absolute certainty of a zealot that any other worldview is heresy. It is the certainty of a collapsing society that the past no longer matters, or the certainty of a new generation that the old ways are obsolete. This is the chilling thread that connects a Roman soldier in Carthage to a Spanish friar in a Maya town square. They did not destroy out of a lack of understanding, but from an overabundance of conviction. They believed they were right, and in that belief, they felt justified in erasing the intellectual legacy of entire civilizations. The loss of science was not the primary goal, but it was always, inevitably, the catastrophic collateral damage. This historical pattern forces us to look at our own certainties, our own ideological battles, and ask what we might be willing to sacrifice in their name. Are we, in our own way, creating the conditions for a future, silent library? That certainty from the past is not a relic. It is a warning that echoes directly into our present moment. We live in an age of seemingly infinite information, where the sum of human knowledge feels just a click away. Yet, our modern world is creating its own forms of library burning, often silent and invisible. Consider the fragility of our digital archives. A hard drive fails in a server farm. A file format, like an old floppy disk, becomes unreadable because the software to open it no longer exists. A cloud storage service shuts down. This is data degradation and format obsolescence, the digital equivalent of papyrus crumbling to dust or ink fading on parchment. We are producing more information than any civilization in history, but we may be preserving less of it for the long term than the scribes of Nineveh who baked their records into clay. Then there are the more deliberate modern parallels. Cyber attacks can hold entire hospital or university databases hostage, encrypting research and records, effectively holding knowledge for ransom. In times of conflict, we see the looting of museums and archives, a direct echo of ancient sackings. The tragic loss of artifacts and manuscripts from the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad in 2003 is a stark, contemporary mirror to the destruction of the House of Wisdom in the very same city centuries before. Even more subtly, there is the deliberate deletion or suppression of scientific data for political or commercial reasons, a quiet editing of the collective record that shapes what future generations will believe is true. So our crucial question shifts from what was lost to what we might still lose. What are our great libraries today? They are not just physical buildings, though those remain vital. They are the vast, distributed networks of digital repositories, the open access journals, the climate data sets, the genetic libraries, and yes, the physical museums and archaeological sites that are the primary sources of our history. Safeguarding them requires a conscious, global effort. It means investing in universal digital archives that use stable, open formats and are copied in multiple locations around the world, a practice inspired by the ancient monks who copied manuscripts to preserve them. It means championing open access science, so that research funded by the public belongs to the public and cannot be hidden or lost behind a corporate paywall. And it means physically protecting cultural heritage sites from the ravages of war and neglect, recognizing them not as political symbols, but as the shared hard drives of humanity's memory. The story of the 20 destroyed libraries is ultimately a story about choice. Every generation chooses what it values enough to save for the next. Will we be the ones who, through neglect or conviction, allow another great silence to descend? Or will we learn from the ashes of Alexandria and the blackened waters of the Tigris, and choose instead to be the most diligent, compassionate librarians our species has ever known. The future is waiting for our answer,